Samuel had lived with the silence for so long that he thought he knew how it would always feel. The quiet of an empty home, the soft footsteps of daughters grown into women, the echoes of laughter that belonged to another time, it was all familiar now. But the moment that letter arrived or that knock came, the air seemed to thicken. Memories he had carefully tucked away began creeping back in. The mornings when Amina would insist on having breakfast ready just as he left for work, the nights she would sit beside him and talk about dreams he could barely afford, and the way her eyes would light up with hope even when money was scarce. Those memories were a mix of warmth and pain, a bitter reminder of everything lost. The daughters gathered in the living room, their faces a mixture of curiosity and guarded suspicion. Naomi, the eldest, now 29, had taken on the weight of the household like a second mother, quietly managing what Samuel could not. She had inherited her father's patience but also his quiet anger. Then there was Lydia, fiery and outspoken, who refused to forgive so easily. The middle girls, Esther and Ruth, had learned to blend in, keeping their feelings hidden, while the youngest, Hannah and Grace, still carried that lingering ache of childhood abandonment, though now it was wrapped in cautious adulthood. Each of them had grown stronger because of the hardship, but the scars remained, invisible yet unshakable. Amina's life, on the other hand, had been a story of contrast. She had escaped the struggles of poverty and carved a name for herself in a city far from where Samuel and the girls lived. Success came quickly, and with it, a sense of freedom she had longed for. But even in the height of comfort, she was never free from the shadows of her past. There were nights she would lie awake, staring at the ceiling of her opulent home, haunted by the images of 6 little faces looking back at her as she walked away. She told herself it was for the best, that her leaving had been necessary for survival, but deep down she wondered if survival was truly worth the cost of her family's love. The knock at the door that day was not just a knock, it was a ripple through Samuel's carefully built life. When the door opened, there she was. Older, more poised, a woman who had transformed every hardship into elegance, yet the eyes still held something familiar, something that could pierce straight to the heart. The daughters could hardly believe what they were seeing. Some stiffened, some took a step back, and some, like Naomi, stood firm, trying to hide the trembling in her hands. Amina didn't speak immediately. She seemed to be measuring the moment, scanning the room, the faces, the expressions that had changed so much yet carried echoes of the little girls she had left behind. Samuel's voice broke first, quiet but steady, asking the question they all feared, "Why now?" Her answer was slow, measured, careful. I have my reasons," she said, and that alone sent a chill down everyone's spine. There was guilt, yes, but also pride and perhaps fear. She had lived a life without them, but facing them again was different. This wasn't a reunion she could control. This was a collision of decades of choices, and she didn't know which part of the family she would reach, or if she could reach anyone at all. As they all stood there, the tension thickened. The daughters exchanged glances, each silently asking, "What does she want after all these years? Is it an apology, a claim, or something darker?" Their minds raced with memories they had tried to bury. Naomi remembered her mother's face at the bus station, turning away without a backward glance. Lydia remembered trying to hold her younger sisters and crying when no one else could see. Esther and Ruth remembered feeling invisible, even as Samuel did everything he could. And Hannah and Grace, still so young back then, had built walls around themselves, unsure if they could ever trust a mother who had left them so abruptly. Outside, the sun was beginning to dip, casting long shadows across the yard, shadows that seemed to stretch into the house, into the hearts of everyone inside. It was as if the day itself was holding its breath, waiting to see what would unfold. Samuel's hands trembled slightly as he reached for a chair to sit, to steady himself, but he didn't want to let Amina see weakness. He had carried the family alone for decades. He could not let her presence shake the foundation he had built. Meanwhile, Amina's own thoughts were racing. She had imagined this reunion countless times, yet reality was nothing like she expected. The girls were not children anymore. They were women with their own lives, their own pain, and perhaps their own grudges. And Samuel, he looked older, yes, but there was something unbroken in him, something that neither time nor heartbreak could erase. She wondered, not for the first time, if leaving had been a mistake. Could she walk back into this family and be forgiven? Or had too much time passed for forgiveness to matter? No one spoke for a long moment, the silence stretching, making each heartbeat louder than the last. The daughters, Samuel and Amina, were caught in a web of unspoken words, unresolved emotions, and years of unanswered questions. And in that silence, the weight of the past pressed down on them, heavier than anything in the present. Then, without warning, Amina reached into her bag and pulled out an envelope. The daughters froze. Samuel's eyes narrowed, a mix of fear and anticipation crossing his face. The envelope was thick, official-looking, but its contents were unknown. It was a message from the past, a key to a story that had been left unfinished, a spark that could ignite long-buried truths, or open wounds no one was ready to face. The room held its breath. No one moved, no one spoke. Everyone knew that once the envelope was opened, nothing would be the same. The question lingered, heavy and sharp. After 25 years, what exactly had Amina brought back into their lives? And more importantly, was it the kind of truth they could survive? Samuel had lived with the silence for so long that he thought he knew how it would always feel. The quiet of an empty home, the soft footsteps of daughters grown into women, the echoes of laughter that belonged to another time, it was all familiar now. But the moment that letter arrived or that knock came, the air seemed to thicken. Memories he had carefully tucked away began creeping back in. The mornings when Amina would insist on having breakfast ready just as he left for work, the nights she would sit beside him and talk about dreams he could barely afford, and the way her eyes would light up with hope even when money was scarce. Those memories were a mix of warmth and pain, a bitter reminder of everything lost. The daughters gathered in the living room, their faces a mixture of curiosity and guarded suspicion. Naomi, the eldest, now 29, had taken on the weight of the household like a second mother, quietly managing what Samuel could not. She had inherited her father's patience but also his quiet anger. Then there was Lydia, fiery and outspoken, who refused to forgive so easily. The middle girls, Esther and Ruth, had learned to blend in, keeping their feelings hidden, while the youngest, Hannah and Grace, still carried that lingering ache of childhood abandonment, though now it was wrapped in cautious adulthood. Each of them had grown stronger because of the hardship, but the scars remained, invisible yet unshakable. Amina's life, on the other hand, had been a story of contrast. She had escaped the struggles of poverty and carved a name for herself in a city far from where Samuel and the girls lived. Success came quickly, and with it, a sense of freedom she had longed for. But even in the height of comfort, she was never free from the shadows of her past. There were nights she would lie awake, staring at the ceiling of her opulent home, haunted by the images of 6 little faces looking back at her as she walked away. She told herself it was for the best, that her leaving had been necessary for survival, but deep down she wondered if survival was truly worth the cost of her family's love. The knock at the door that day was not just a knock, it was a ripple through Samuel's carefully built life. When the door opened, there she was. Older, more poised, a woman who had transformed every hardship into elegance, yet the eyes still held something familiar, something that could pierce straight to the heart. The daughters could hardly believe what they were seeing. Some stiffened, some took a step back, and some, like Naomi, stood firm, trying to hide the trembling in her hands. Amina didn't speak immediately. She seemed to be measuring the moment, scanning the room, the faces, the expressions that had changed so much yet carried echoes of the little girls she had left behind. Samuel's voice broke first, quiet but steady, asking the question they all feared, "Why now?" Her answer was slow, measured, careful. I have my reasons," she said, and that alone sent a chill down everyone's spine. There was guilt, yes, but also pride and perhaps fear. She had lived a life without them, but facing them again was different. This wasn't a reunion she could control. This was a collision of decades of choices, and she didn't know which part of the family she would reach, or if she could reach anyone at all. As they all stood there, the tension thickened. The daughters exchanged glances, each silently asking, "What does she want after all these years? Is it an apology, a claim, or something darker?" Their minds raced with memories they had tried to bury. Naomi remembered her mother's face at the bus station, turning away without a backward glance. Lydia remembered trying to hold her younger sisters and crying when no one else could see. Esther and Ruth remembered feeling invisible, even as Samuel did everything he could. And Hannah and Grace, still so young back then, had built walls around themselves, unsure if they could ever trust a mother who had left them so abruptly. Outside, the sun was beginning to dip, casting long shadows across the yard, shadows that seemed to stretch into the house, into the hearts of everyone inside. It was as if the day itself was holding its breath, waiting to see what would unfold. Samuel's hands trembled slightly as he reached for a chair to sit, to steady himself, but he didn't want to let Amina see weakness. He had carried the family alone for decades. He could not let her presence shake the foundation he had built. Meanwhile, Amina's own thoughts were racing. She had imagined this reunion countless times, yet reality was nothing like she expected. The girls were not children anymore. They were women with their own lives, their own pain, and perhaps their own grudges. And Samuel, He looked older, yes, but there was something unbroken in him, something that neither time nor heartbreak could erase. She wondered, not for the first time, if leaving had been a mistake. Could she walk back into this family and be forgiven? Or had too much time passed for forgiveness to matter? No one spoke for a long moment, the silence stretching, making each heartbeat louder than the last. The daughters, Samuel and Amina, were caught in a web of unspoken words, unresolved emotions, and years of unanswered questions. And in that silence, the weight of the past pressed down on them, heavier than anything in the present. Then, without warning, Amina reached into her bag and pulled out an envelope. The daughters froze. Samuel's eyes narrowed, a mix of fear and anticipation crossing his face. The envelope was thick, official-looking, but its contents were unknown. It was a message from the past, a key to a story that had been left unfinished, a spark that could ignite long-buried truths, or open wounds no one was ready to face. The room held its breath. No one moved, no one spoke. Everyone knew that once the envelope was opened, nothing would be the same. The question lingered, heavy and sharp. After 25 years, what exactly had Amina brought back into their lives? And more importantly, was it the kind of truth they could survive? The envelope sat on the table like a loaded question, its presence heavier than any words that could be spoken. Samuel glanced at it, then at Amina, trying to read her face. Was this a gesture of peace? Or a carefully planned intrusion into a life she had abandoned decades ago? Naomi reached forward, her fingers brushing the envelope, then pulling back as if it might burn her. "Mom, what is this?" she asked, her voice steady but trembling. Amina hesitated, her eyes flicking across the room at each of her daughters, weighing her words. "It's something I need you all to see," she said carefully, as if every syllable required courage. The daughters exchanged silent glances. Curiosity warred with anger. Could this envelope undo 25 years of absence? Or was it just another reminder of betrayal? Lydia, always the boldest, leaned forward, her sharp eyes fixed on Amina. "After all this time, why should we care?" she asked, the accusation cutting through the tension like a knife. Amina flinched, but only slightly. She had expected anger, even hatred, but hearing it from her daughters still shook her in ways she hadn't anticipated. Because the past isn't done with us yet," she replied. There was a tremor in her voice, a crack that suggested vulnerability. She had spent years building walls around herself, convincing herself that leaving was the right choice, but standing in that room facing the daughters she had abandoned, those walls felt thinner than ever. Meanwhile, Samuel remained quiet, watching, listening, waiting. He had spent his life shielding the girls from the harsh realities of their past, protecting them from the bitterness he himself had felt. But this envelope, this sudden reappearance, was a storm he could not stop. He wondered, not for the first time, what had driven Amina to leave so long ago. Poverty, yes, but was it pride too? Fear? Or something deeper, something no one had ever spoken about? Esther and Ruth sat together, holding hands almost instinctively, their eyes wary but alert. They had grown up watching their sisters and father struggle, and they had learned early that survival often meant keeping emotions locked away. Yet now, with Amina back in the room, they felt those old questions stirring. Could a mother's love really vanish completely? Could someone who walked away for convenience, or for fear, truly come back with anything that mattered? Hannah and Grace, the youngest, were the most visibly unsettled. Though they were now adults, they still carried the raw edges of childhood abandonment. Grace finally spoke, her voice soft but firm. "You left us. You chose your life over us. And now, what do you want from us?" There was no hatred in her tone, only a need for understanding, a demand for truth. The room seemed to hold its breath again, waiting for Amina's response. Amina opened the envelope slowly, deliberately. Inside was a stack of papers, each one marked with dates and letters, official stamps and signatures. The daughters leaned closer, instinctively drawn to the proof of something larger than words. These are documents," Naomi whispered. "What are they?" Amina's eyes met Samuel's for a fleeting moment. "It's everything about the life I left behind, about choices I made, and about what I never told you." Samuel's brow furrowed. He had long wondered why she had left so suddenly, without explanation, without even a hint of regret. These documents, whatever they were, promised answers, but answers that might be more complicated than anyone was ready for. The daughters sensed it too. This was no simple apology, it was a revelation waiting to explode. As Amina began to explain, the story started to shift. She spoke of debts she had feared Samuel could never pay, of pressures from her family that had weighed on her, of promises she felt unable to keep. Each revelation peeled back layers of her character, showing a woman torn between survival and love, between pride and fear. But for the daughters, it was also a test of perception. Could they see the human being behind the mistakes? Or would the years of absence be an insurmountable wall? Lydia, never one to hold back, challenged every statement. "So you left because of money?" she said, her voice rising slightly. "You left your husband, your daughters, your home, because he wasn't rich enough?" Amina flinched at the bluntness but did not answer immediately. Instead, she turned her gaze to the youngest, Hannah and Grace, as if seeking a connection that might reach them in ways words could not. "It wasn't that simple," she whispered. "And there are things you don't yet know. Things that might change everything you believe about that day, about me, about all of us." The tension thickened, each word a spark threatening to ignite a fire. Questions swirled in the room like invisible currents. What exactly had Amina kept hidden? Was her leaving an act of self-preservation, or were there other secrets buried beneath pride and fear? Could Samuel, after all these years, truly forgive? Could the daughters reconcile the mother they remembered with the woman standing before them now? No one moved. No one spoke. The envelope sat open, revealing the start of answers, but also the promise of more mysteries. Samuel's hand rested lightly on the table, steady but uncertain. Naomi's eyes were fixed on Amina, searching for signs of sincerity. Lydia's posture was rigid, unyielding. Esther and Ruth exchanged a glance, silently communicating a mix of caution and curiosity. Hannah and Grace hovered on the edge of disbelief and hope. And in that quiet, heavy moment, one thing was clear. The past had returned, and it was not leaving quietly. It demanded answers, it demanded confrontation, and it demanded truth. Yet no one knew what the first step should be, or if any of them could handle the truths about to unfold. Amina's return had reopened wounds that had never fully healed, and every heartbeat in the room carried the weight of a story that was far from over. The daughters would soon learn that the envelope contained more than explanations. It contained questions that might change everything. But for now, the room held its silence, a tense pause before the storm. And outside, the evening settled, casting long shadows into the house, shadows that seemed to whisper a single haunting question. After 25 years, can a family broken by choice ever be whole again? The room felt smaller than it had ever been, as if the walls themselves were leaning in to listen. The daughters, gathered around the table, leaned closer to the envelope, though no one dared touch it. Samuel's heart pounded with a rhythm he hadn't felt in decades, a mixture of fear, hope, and anticipation. Each paper inside held a fragment of the past, a puzzle piece that could either explain everything or shatter what little piece they had built. Amina's voice trembled as she began to speak again, revealing details she had hidden for years. She spoke of debts and threats, of family pressures that had clawed at her life, and of sacrifices she thought were necessary to survive. "I thought leaving would save you from my mistakes," she whispered, almost to herself. The daughters stared, some in disbelief, others in rising anger. They wanted answers, but the answers she gave seemed half-truths, carefully shaped, leaving more questions than they answered. Naomi's hands shook slightly as she reached for one of the papers. She read aloud, her voice steadying as she tried to make sense of the complex web of letters, transactions, and notes. There's something here about a house, a business, money that was sent but never reached Dad?" Her eyes flicked to Samuel, searching for any hint of understanding. Samuel's face tightened. He had known hardship, but he had also known the pain of secrets hidden in plain sight. Every revelation brought a mix of relief and suspicion. Was this Amina trying to justify herself? Or was she finally telling the truth? Lydia's voice broke the silence again, sharp and cutting. "So all these years, all the lies, the absence, it's about money? About fear? About pride?" Her question hung in the air, demanding an answer that Amina hesitated to give. She opened her mouth, paused, and then shook her head slowly. "It's more than that," she said. "There are things I couldn't tell you then, things I still fear telling you now." Esther and Ruth exchanged a glance, sensing that the story was bigger than any of them had imagined. They had grown up thinking they understood why she left, but each new detail hinted at secrets that stretched far beyond poverty or ambition. The tension in the room grew heavier, thick with the weight of years, the weight of unspoken words, and the tension of emotions long suppressed. Hannah and Grace, the youngest, now felt an unease they hadn't experienced since childhood. The envelope seemed almost alive, its contents radiating the power to change everything. "What do you mean, things you couldn't tell us?" Grace finally asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Amina's eyes filled with tears she hadn't allowed herself to shed in decades. Some choices I made weren't just about leaving. They were about survival. But survival comes at a price, she said, her words trembling, heavy with fear and regret. The daughters felt a mixture of fear, anger, and curiosity. Each sentence seemed to pull them deeper into a story they thought they had left behind, a story that was far more complicated than they had imagined. Samuel watched, his own chest tight, feeling both pride and sorrow. He had raised these daughters through hardship, through absence, through the unyielding weight of betrayal. And now, as Amina revealed pieces of a past he thought he understood, he realized that the family he had fought to keep intact was more fragile, and more unpredictable, than ever before. As the evening stretched on, the tension escalated. Amina began speaking about a decision she had made that night 25 years ago, a decision that had rippled into every corner of their lives. She spoke of fear, of choices made in desperation, and of consequences she had not foreseen. The daughters listened, frozen, caught between the desire to understand and the instinct to recoil. Each revelation was like a spark in dry grass, threatening to ignite emotions that had lain dormant for decades. Naomi's voice broke the silence again. So you left us, because you were afraid? Afraid of what? Afraid of him? Afraid of life. The question lingered, sharper than any accusation. Amina hesitated, and the room felt the weight of her hesitation. It was clear that her truth was not simple. It was messy, human, and dangerous. Dangerous because it could undo the fragile balance they had built over 25 years. The daughters' emotions were a storm. Anger, resentment, curiosity, and even a glimmer of longing swirled in the air. Samuel's gaze shifted from one daughter to another, silently pleading for understanding, for patience, for a chance to confront a past that had been buried too long. He had kept the household together through his own strength, but now, faced with the person who had shattered their lives, he realized that strength alone would not be enough. Outside, the wind picked up, rattling the windows, adding a restless rhythm to the tension inside. Shadows from the trees stretched across the room, dark and distorted, mirroring the tangled emotions of everyone within. No one spoke, yet everyone felt the unspoken weight. The past was returning with a force none of them could control. And then Amina paused, her hand hovering over the envelope. There's one thing, one truth you need to know before any of this can make sense, she said, her voice low, almost a whisper. The daughters leaned forward instinctively, their hearts pounding in unison. Samuel's hand clenched the edge of the table. The room seemed to shrink further, the air heavier, every breath tight with anticipation. Amina's eyes met each of theirs, and in that gaze was a promise and a warning. But once I tell you, there's no going back. The life you knew, the past you remember, it will change forever. The daughters exchanged terrified glances. Samuel's jaw tightened. The moment had arrived, the moment when the past and present collided. Every secret, every hidden choice, every unanswered question was about to surface. And yet, no one knew how they would survive the truth. The envelope remained open, but the final revelation, the truth that could either destroy them or bring them together, had not yet been spoken. The tension, the fear, the curiosity all reached a peak. Hearts raced, breaths quickened, and the family, fractured by time and choice, waited on the edge of a story that would change everything. Amina's hand hovered over the papers, trembling slightly. The room was deathly silent, each person leaning in as if even a single word spoken could shatter the fragile tension. Samuel's chest tightened. He had braced himself for her to explain why she left, but something in her eyes told him this was different. Something bigger. There's more, she whispered. Her voice was almost inaudible, yet it cut through the quiet like a knife. Something I never told anyone. Something that changes everything you think you know about that day. The daughters exchanged glances. Naomi's eyes narrowed, instinctively stepping closer. Lydia stiffened, fists clenched at her sides. Even the youngest, Hannah and Grace, instinctively gripped each other's hands, feeling the weight of the unknown. Samuel swallowed hard. He had spent decades piecing together the past from fragments of memories and whispered questions, but this felt like a story that could undo everything. Amina reached into the envelope and pulled out another document, one that looked older, more worn than the others. This, she began, pausing, this isn't just about money, or pride, or the life I wanted to build. It's about a decision I made that affected all of you in ways I never imagined. Her eyes flicked to Samuel, lingering with something unspoken. You have to understand, what I'm about to tell you, it will make you question everything. Naomi's hand trembled as she reached for the paper, her mind racing. Mom, just tell us, she urged. Lydia's voice was tight, sharp. Stop holding back. We deserve the truth. The room felt electric, the tension almost unbearable. Samuel could feel it too. The past was no longer a memory, it was alive, pressing into the present with a force that none of them could escape. Amina took a deep breath, her eyes filling with tears she had fought to hold back for years. When I left, she said slowly, it wasn't just because I thought we couldn't survive financially, there was someone else involved. Someone who made me believe I had no choice. Her words hung in the air, heavy and impossible to ignore. The daughters gasped, shock rippling through the room. Samuel's face went pale, his heart hammering in his chest. Someone else. Lydia echoed, her voice barely controlled. You left Dad for someone else? The question was almost accusatory, but Amina shook her head. No, not in the way you think. It wasn't about love. It was about a threat, a danger I never told you about. The daughters stared, confusion and disbelief battling with the anger that had been simmering for years. Samuel's hands clenched the table. He had prepared for explanations, excuses, apologies, but never this. Grace, voice quivering, finally spoke. A threat? What kind of threat? Amina's eyes darted to each of them in turn, as if weighing how much she could reveal. It was your father's life, she whispered. And your lives too. That night I left. I believed leaving was the only way to protect you. The room went still, the weight of her words settling like a physical presence. The daughters felt a chill run down their spines. Protection? After all these years? Was it possible? Or was it another justification for abandoning them? Samuel's jaw tightened. Protection? You left us in the dark for 25 years, and you call that protection? His voice trembled, a mix of anger, disbelief, and heartbreak. Amina flinched, but her gaze remained steady. I know it sounds impossible to forgive, she admitted, her voice low. But if you had known, if anyone had known, things could have been worse. I had no choice. The daughters' minds raced. Their mother, the woman who had abandoned them, had risked everything, or so she claimed. Naomi studied the papers, scanning the details. Dates, names, cryptic notes about business partners and threats, names they didn't recognize. This looks like someone was after you? After Dad? She asked. Samuel shook his head slowly. No. Whoever it was, they never came for me directly, he said. But if what she's saying is true, this isn't just about leaving us. This is bigger. Much bigger. Lydia's fists clenched tighter. So, all these years, our anger, our pain, maybe it wasn't just about money or pride. Maybe it's about danger? Her voice wavered between disbelief and something darker, fear. Hannah and Grace exchanged a look, suddenly understanding that the story of their mother's disappearance was more complex than they had ever imagined. The mother they had blamed, hated, and mourned had been carrying secrets that could have saved or destroyed them all. Amina's eyes glistened as she reached for another paper. There's one more thing, she said, her voice trembling. Something you have to see. It's why I came back, after all these years. She laid it on the table slowly. The daughters leaned forward instinctively. Samuel's eyes widened. The document was official, with stamps and signatures, and contained details about events and people none of them had ever heard of. Names that should have been familiar were absent, replaced by a network of threats, debts, and hidden dangers that stretched far beyond their understanding. The room felt suffocating. Every revelation layered on the last, tension stacking upon tension. The daughters, their father, and even Amina herself were caught in the center of a story that was no longer just about abandonment, poverty, or regret. It was about survival, secrecy, and consequences none of them could have imagined. Every glance, every breath carried the weight of unspoken fears. And in that silence, one thought ran through all of them. If this was the truth, then the past was not done with them. The story of Amina's return, of her abandonment, of Samuel's struggle, of the daughter's heartbreak, it was only the beginning. The danger she had hinted at, the secrets she had buried, the choices she had made to protect them, they were about to collide with the present in ways no one was prepared for. The envelope sat open, papers spread across the table, secrets waiting to be revealed. And as the family stared, hearts pounding and minds racing, one thing became clear. Nothing would ever be the same again. The past had returned, and it was demanding to be faced. The room was thick with tension, each heartbeat loud, each breath heavy. Amina's eyes glistened, the last fragments of fear and guilt shining through. Samuel's gaze never wavered, though every muscle in his body seemed tense with anticipation. The daughters leaned in, their hands clutching one another, their minds racing. The envelope on the table was no longer just a pile of papers. It was the key to everything, the truth that had been buried for 25 years. Amina drew a deep breath and spoke, her voice steady despite the tremor of emotion beneath it. When I left, I thought I was protecting you all. Samuel, I thought leaving would keep you safe from the people I had crossed. The people who wanted to take everything from us, even our lives. I believed the only way to survive was to disappear, to hide, to let the family I loved carry on without me. She paused, letting the weight of her words settle. I know it sounds cruel. And I know I hurt all of you. But everything I did out of fear and love. Naomi's eyes filled with tears. All this time, you weren't just selfish. You were scared. You left to protect us? Her voice trembled, a mixture of disbelief and relief. Lydia, though still tense, finally seemed to soften. But why didn't you ever try to reach out? Why not tell us anything? Amina's hands shook as she answered. Because I didn't know if it was safe. And because I thought, maybe you'd never forgive me. Samuel's chest loosened slightly. He had spent decades carrying anger, sorrow, and the weight of abandonment, yet hearing the truth, seeing the fear and love in Amina's eyes, he felt something shift inside him. You left us, yes, he said quietly, but you also survived. And somehow, you carried us in your heart all this time. His voice cracked, but the room felt lighter. The daughters, one by one, confronted their own emotions. Naomi stepped forward, placing a hand on Amina's. You hurt us, but we see now that there was more going on than we knew. Maybe, we can try to understand. Lydia's arms crossed, but the edge in her voice softened. It doesn't erase the past. But maybe, we can start somewhere. The middle daughters, Esther and Ruth, nodded quietly. Hannah and Grace, though still wary, reached for their mother tentatively. Amina's eyes filled with tears she had held back for decades. I never stopped thinking about you all. Every decision, every choice I made, it was with you in mind even if it didn't feel like it. I was wrong to leave the way I did. And I hope, someday you can forgive me. Samuel finally reached out, placing a steadying hand on her shoulder. It's time we faced the past together, he said. All of us. The air in the room seemed to shift. Years of tension, anger, and unanswered questions began to melt into something fragile but real, the possibility of reconciliation. The daughters sat closer, Samuel and Amina exchanging a glance that spoke of tentative trust. For the first time in decades, the family felt whole, even if only slightly. The storm that had haunted them seemed to calm, or so it seemed. Then, just as the relief began to settle, Amina pulled one more paper from the envelope. Her eyes widened as she scanned it. Wait, this can't be right, she whispered, her voice shaking. Samuel leaned forward, peering over her shoulder. The daughters leaned in, curiosity mixing with the remnants of fear. The document revealed something unexpected. Someone else had been involved all those years ago, someone they had never suspected. Someone who had influenced Amina's departure. Someone whose presence could rewrite everything they had just uncovered. Naomi's hand flew to her mouth. Who could it be? She asked, heart pounding. Lydia's eyes narrowed, instincts kicking in. Someone we know? She demanded. Amina shook her head slowly, still staring at the paper. It's someone very close. Someone we all trusted. And if the truth comes out, it could change everything again. The daughters stared at one another, a new tension settling in. Samuel's jaw clenched. For a moment, the family thought the past was behind them, but now the shadows of old secrets loomed larger than ever. The envelope, which had already held decades of truth, now promised more, twists, revelations, and choices that none of them were prepared to face. And in that moment, one thing was certain. The story was far from over. The truth that had begun to heal old wounds now threatened to reopen them. The past had returned in full force, and the family realized that survival, forgiveness, and love were still challenges they would have to face together, or risk losing everything again. The camera would fade out, lingering on the open envelope, the daughters' tense faces, Samuel's steady but worried gaze, and Amina's tearful expression. Outside, the wind picked up, rattling the windows as if the world itself was holding its breath, waiting to see what the next chapter would bring. And just like that, the audience would be left with a single burning question. After 25 years, could a family torn apart by fear, poverty, and secrets ever truly survive the truth? Or was the real danger only just beginning? The days that followed were quiet, but charged with a sense of reflection. The tension from Amina's return had not disappeared entirely, but it had shifted. Instead of anger and fear, the family now carried cautious curiosity, a willingness to understand the woman who had once walked away, and the truths she had revealed. Samuel, who had endured decades of hardship, began to see the bigger picture, not just the pain of the past but the resilience that had carried them all through. Amina stayed in the house, slowly rebuilding trust one gesture at a time. The daughters watched her, studied her actions, and measured the sincerity in her eyes. Naomi, ever the careful planner, took the lead in bridging the gap. She sat with her mother for hours, asking questions, sharing memories, and allowing herself to finally release years of pent-up frustration. "I want to understand," Naomi said one evening, "but it doesn't mean I forget. It just means I'm willing to listen." Lydia, though stubborn and fiery, softened too. She couldn't erase the hurt of being left, but she began to see Amina as a human being, someone who had been scared, who had made terrible choices, and yet had returned seeking a kind of redemption. "You made mistakes," Lydia said bluntly, "but maybe we can start over in some way." Her words were a quiet surrender, a sign that the family could move forward without pretending the past never happened. Hannah and Grace, who had carried the rawest wounds, approached Amina slowly. At first, the conversations were short, awkward, filled with pauses and nervous glances. But over time, laughter began to return to the house, small moments of connection that reminded them all that family was more than perfection. It was love, resilience, and patience. They discovered that even decades of absence couldn't erase the bond that had always existed beneath the surface. Samuel watched all of this quietly, sometimes reflecting on the years of struggle he had endured alone. He realized that forgiveness wasn't about forgetting the past, it was about choosing to move forward despite it. He and Amina began to talk not as husband and wife, not immediately, but as two people who shared a history that had shaped them both. They talked about the dangers she had once hinted at, about the people and circumstances that had forced her into impossible decisions, and about how much strength it had taken to survive and return. Each conversation peeled away layers of misunderstanding, and slowly respect began to replace resentment. The papers in the envelope were carefully studied and organized. Samuel discovered that some of Amina's warnings had been true. Financial mismanagement and hidden threats had put the family at risk. But there were also gaps in understanding, moments where fear had exaggerated what was necessary. By facing these truths together, the family began to see a path forward, one where knowledge replaced fear and honesty replaced secrecy. The daughters learned about sacrifices their mother had made quietly, choices that had been misunderstood as selfishness. It didn't erase the pain, but it gave them clarity and a reason to rebuild trust. One afternoon, the family gathered in the courtyard, sunlight spilling across the walls and floor. It was the first time in decades that they all felt a sense of peace, however fragile. Naomi spoke first. "We've all been through so much. We felt abandoned, angry, and afraid. But we've also survived. And surviving is something no one can take away from us." She glanced at her sisters, at her father, and finally at Amina. "Maybe now, we can start really living together again." Lydia added, softly, "Life isn't about perfection. It's about trying even when it's hard. We've all had to learn that in different ways." Hannah and Grace nodded, understanding for the first time that their mother's mistakes didn't have to define them, or the family. Samuel looked around at his daughters and at Amina, feeling a deep sense of gratitude. "We've carried each other through pain and now we can carry each other through healing," he said. "It won't be easy, but nothing worth having ever is." Amina, finally letting herself feel the weight of decades lifted slightly from her shoulders, smiled through tears. "I can't change the past. I can't undo the years I lost with all of you. But I can be here now and I want to try, if you'll let me." The daughter's hands slowly reached for hers, a gesture of acceptance, a quiet acknowledgement that the family they had once lost could be found again. Even the shadows of danger that had haunted her years before seemed less threatening now. The family had faced secrets, lies, and threats together and survived. The trust they rebuilt wasn't instant, but it was real. They learned that love and forgiveness weren't about erasing the past. They were about choosing to embrace the present and move forward together. And yet, in the quiet moments, there was still mystery. The documents had hinted at larger forces, unseen players, and decisions that had ripple effects beyond their small household. The family knew they would face challenges again, that life could be unpredictable, and that the past could still influence the future. But now they faced it together, stronger for what they had endured, wiser for what they had learned, and bound by a renewed understanding of what family truly meant. As the sun set, casting a warm glow across the courtyard, the family sat together, sharing stories, laughter, and moments of reflection. They understood that abandonment, poverty, fear, and regret had once torn them apart, but resilience, patience, and love had brought them back together. Samuel looked at Amina and said quietly, "Maybe life gave us a second chance we didn't know we needed." Amina nodded, and the daughters smiled, a mixture of joy and cautious hope in their eyes. The past had shaped them, but it no longer controlled them. They were together, and that was enough, for now. And just as the light faded from the sky, a soft sound came from the mailroom, another envelope unmarked, waiting. The family paused, exchanging curious glances. For a moment, the story felt complete, yet life reminded them that even after resolution, surprises could always come. They laughed softly, tension easing, knowing that whatever the future held, they would face it as a family. They had survived abandonment, poverty, secrets, and fear. And now, after 25 years, they had found the strength to forgive, to understand, and to embrace the family they had always been, even if imperfect, even if late. The story ended, but the lessons remained. Love can survive absence, forgiveness can heal old wounds, and sometimes the greatest strength lies in choosing to face the truth together.